Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Joey Merlino, the modern face of Philadelphia's underworld, a man whose charm, ambition, and street-smart style made him one of the most talked-about mob figures of his time. Known as Skinny Joey, Merlino balanced danger with charisma, leading with confidence while living life on the edge of power and fame. As you close your eyes, imagine the flashing city lights, the quiet meetings, and the whispers of loyalty and betrayal that surrounded his name. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video, your support motivates us to keep bringing you these stories. Now, take a deep breath and let the silence of the night draw you in. Joseph Merlino entered the world on the 13th of March 1962 in Philadelphia, into a family already entwined with the city's underworld history. His father, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, rose high in the hierarchy during the Nicky Scarfo era, a stretch of years when South Philly felt the weight of old country codes meeting American streets. In row homes near the Italian market, the Merlino name carried both affection and fear, the complicated respect that comes when everyone knows your relatives and what they're rumored to be capable of. Friends remember Joey as small-framed but athletic, a kid who loved sports and neighborhood competition, who earned the nickname that would trail him forever. The home life, though, sat under an austere shadow. In that neighborhood, lines between social clubs, corner stores, and backroom deals were thin. As he grew into his 20s, the gravity of his father's position and the enemies it could bring never sat far away. The late 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds were turbulent for Philadelphia's organized crime landscape. Federal pressure mounted. The Scarfo regime drew sustained attention because of a violent reputation that invited task forces, wiretaps, and high-profile trials. In 1988, the government won sweeping racketeering convictions against Scarfo and key lieutenants, including Chucky Merlino. That case fractured families and set sons against a future shaped by newspapers and sentencing memos. Joey watched his father receive a long federal term, the kind of sentence that changes a household's routines permanently. For a young man in South Philly, that loss of a father's daily presence landed with a mix of anger, independence, and resolve. He loved his father, and he never forgot who had been in charge when the family's fortunes turned. By then, law enforcement already had Joey on its radar. Detectives and agents linked his name to gambling circles and street activity, a reflection of the neighborhood's ecosystem. Through the latter half of the 1,980 seconds, he faced recurring contact with police, and he did a federal stretch before the 1,990 seconds began to turn. Those years behind the wire hardened reputations all around. To investigators, Joey looked like a next-generation figurehead, hungry and visible. To neighbors, he was the guy who knew everybody, could make a party happen, and walked with the confidence of someone who understood the stakes. In South Philly, myth and fact tend to meet on the corner. Joey's name lived in that space, at once ordinary and notorious. The early 1,990 seconds brought a shift at the top of Philadelphia's crime family. With Scarfo imprisoned, John Stanfa emerged as boss and tried to steady a wobbly organization. A younger faction pushed back. Alliances formed around Joey and his circle men like Stephen Mazzone and George Borghese, who were brash, media-aware, and convinced the future belonged to them. What followed became one of the city's most public internal power struggles. Philadelphia newspapers tracked brazen attacks on highways and city blocks. One summer day in 1993, gunmen opened fire on Joey on a crowded expressway. He survived wounds that, while serious, were not life-ending. The streets shook again when his close friend Michael "Mikey" Ciancaglini was killed during that same rivalry period. Another figure, Joseph Ciancaglini, who was aligned with the opposing side, was gravely injured in an attempted hit. The war's overall toll jarred residents and drew national attention. It also deepened the government's determination to untangle who was calling shots and who bore responsibility. Joey's stance in public hardened into a pattern. He smiled for cameras, denied the existence of a mafia, and insisted he was simply a neighborhood man whose hospitality got misconstrued. Law enforcement painted a contrasting portrait, describing him as a central player in a younger coalition that used extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and influence to gain leverage. The city watched both narratives develop in parallel. Even people who never met him could pick him out at parades and charity events. In December, there were toy drives and holiday meals for families, with images that humanized a figure more often depicted in mugshots. Over time, he became a paradox that fascinated broadcasters. A man prosecutors said led an enterprise, who simultaneously shook hands at block parties and threw Christmas parties for kids. As federal cases dismantled the older leadership and Stanfa landed in prison after a 1994 indictment and later conviction, the younger set filled the vacuum. In that era, Ralph Natale, an older South Jersey figure who had done time, returned to the streets and, for a while, became a public face for the organization. Accounts differ on titles and pecking order. Prosecutors later argued that Natale served as a front, while Joey acted as the real power in day-to-day matters. Joey rejected that characterization, telling journalists he had nothing to do with any criminal enterprise. What is indisputable is that the 1,990 seconds brought a burst of media attention around him unprecedented for a Philadelphia mob personality. He did not hide. He walked through South Philly unhurried, often stylish, and with a flock of cameras nearby. That openness created a brand charismatic, defiant, and newsworthy that many thought tactically unwise and others viewed as part of his mystique. The mid to late 1,990 seconds saw the FBI and federal prosecutors knit together a sprawling racketeering case. Investigators leaned on surveillance, gambling ledgers, bookmakers, hidden microphones, and cooperators. One pivotal change came when Ralph Natale flipped, cooperating with the government in 1999. His testimony would later claim that Joey held real authority within the family, overseeing gambling and collections and sanctioning violence during the early 1,990 seconds feud. Joey's defense team would say Natale's story was self-serving, inconsistent, and aimed at trading a lifetime of mistakes for a shot at leniency. On television, viewers caught the contours of an old American legal ritual. The government building a case with insiders, the defense challenging credibility, the jury charged with sorting truth from embellishment. By the end of that decade, headlines forecast a showdown. A federal grand jury returned an indictment that bundled racketeering conspiracy with a catalog of alleged acts: gambling, extortion, bookmaking, loan sharking, and counts linked to the internecine conflict. Prosecutors reached back to the war years to argue that the enterprise they described used fear to enforce debts and protect revenue. Joey surrendered and pleaded not guilty, remained steadfast in interviews, and prepared for a trial that would test which parts of Philadelphia's lore would hold up under federal rules of evidence. Supporters still spoke of his public generosity, the view that he brightened neighborhood events and kept problems away from local families. Critics insisted those scenes were theater, masking a structure built on intimidation. The truth, jurors were told, would rest not in personality but in records, recordings, bookmakers' notes, and the consistent overlap of witnesses' accounts. As the new millennium opened, the courtroom became the city's most watched stage. The United States pressed its version with careful steps, reading ledger pages and playing tapes until jurors could recite nicknames with the same ease sports fans talk about their teams. Natale took the stand, and defense lawyers hammered him about motives, memory lapses, and contradictions. The outcome would matter not only for Joey, but for the broader question of whether Philadelphia's LCN structure still had the power and revenue streams the government alleged. While the city woke each day to normal routines, school runs, hoagie lines, morning commutes, its most famous defendant arrived at the courthouse in suits that sharpened the contrast between celebrity and accountability. South Philly, so often a backdrop for stereotypes, watched one of its own become an archetype, and then a test case. Through all of it, Joey stayed unusually visible, waving to well-wishers outside the courthouse and greeting reporters with jokes. While inside, the stakes were life-altering. Those who admired him admired the poise. Those who resented him believed the charm was calculated. For many residents, it was simpler. The city had to outgrow this cycle. Parents wanted kids who remembered South Philly for sports leagues, music, and food, not front-page photos of men in sunglasses with federal agents nearby. Whatever verdicts would come, Philadelphia needed a different story. Yet for the moment, the story belonged to Joey Merlino, to prosecutors laying out alleged rackets, to defense lawyers battling count by count, and to jurors trying to see through personalities to the plain meaning of the law. He had become the embodiment of a civic contradiction, a South Philadelphia son whose roots and charisma were indisputable, whose family history tied him to an era most of the city wanted to retire, and whose fate would hinge on whether jurors believed the charts, tapes, and cooperators more than the man waving on the courthouse steps. The trial felt like a long parade that never quite ended, each day beginning with the shuffle of jurors, the click of cameras, and the same hushed ritual of federal court. Prosecutors unspooled tapes and pointed to betting slips, loans, and the coded language of a tight crew. They leaned heavily on cooperators who described a structure in which debts were collected and gambling action flowed through phones, back rooms, and trusted runners. The centerpiece was Ralph Nathale, who told jurors that he had worn the crown for a time while Joey, as he framed it, drove much of the activity. The defense countered that Nathale was a deal-maker for himself, a man with decades of wrongdoing who now tailored his story to government goals. The cross-examination became a duel over memory, motive, and whether a witness with so many admissions could be trusted to give a clean account. Tape by tape, the government tried to separate charm from conduct. Jurors heard coded chats about bookmakers and whose numbers mattered each week. Agents walked them through ledger sheets, explaining what each column meant and how dollars moved from bettors to collectors. The prosecution said the enterprise used fear without needing to say much, that a name could be enough to keep payments on schedule. They reminded jurors of the early 1990 seconds feud, not with lurid detail but to argue that the organization operated with an understanding of consequence. The defense held to a simple line: charisma is not a crime, association is not proof, and famous nicknames do not meet the legal burden. They noted that surveillance caught a lot of socializing, and not nearly as many clean instructions as the headlines suggested. Every evening, television showed the same images. Joey in a tailored suit, waving to onlookers, smiling at reporters' questions that he had no intention of answering directly. Inside, his lawyers pressed missteps in the investigation, gaps in dates, and contradictions among cooperators. They argued that Nathale's account changed over time, that he offered sweeping statements without corroboration for key incidents. When the government turned to loan sharking and extortion allegations, the defense stressed the difference between rough talk and criminal conduct. For jurors, it was a lesson in the limits of inference and the weight of long-simmering grudges. When the jury finally returned, the result reflected the complexity of the case. Joey was acquitted of the most severe allegations tied to killings from earlier years. He was convicted on racketeering, conspiracy, and related counts involving illegal gambling and extortion as the government defined them. Supporters exhaled with relief that the darkest accusations did not stick. Prosecutors emphasized that the racketeering verdict confirmed the core of their case, that a criminal enterprise existed, and that he had a role in it. The mixed outcome made headlines because it fit the public image somewhere between celebrity and liability, not the sweeping triumph either side had predicted. At sentencing in 2001, the judge reviewed the record, the jury's findings, and the guidelines that shape federal punishment. Joey received a term measured in years, not months. The sentence, roughly a decade and a half, reflected the counts that survived trial and the court's view of leadership. Fines and supervised release conditions followed. He walked out in cuffs with his chin up, having already decided how he would talk about it. He told people he wasn't what the movies imagined. He insisted he was a South Philly guy who got too much attention and too little benefit of the doubt. The legal record, though, was now set. Guilty on racketeering, conspiracy, and related offenses. Not guilty on murder charges. Prison changed the scenery but not the fascination. In federal facilities, first farther from home, then closer as time passed, he settled into routines that thousands of inmates rely on to keep mind and body steady. Early mornings, workouts, card games, sports talk, the quiet grind of a calendar with too few special days. He wrote and received letters. He kept in touch with family and old neighbors. News from Philadelphia filtered in through papers and visitors who got promoted, who got indicted, which neighborhood place still made the best sandwiches. Agents and reporters never stopped talking about him, even when bars and miles separated him from South Philadelphia. To them, he remained a symbol. To many at home, he was a reminder of an era nobody could fully escape. On the streets, others took on leadership roles. Law enforcement described a period in which older hands tried to stabilize business while avoiding the explosive feuds of the early 1990 seconds. Names like Joseph Lee Gombe became stand-ins for a quieter, more cautious approach. There were fresh arrests, acquittals, retrials, and the endless dance of racketeering law. Prosecutors argued that even from inside, reputations cast long shadows. The defense community pushed back at that idea, pointing out how strict the Bureau of Prisons keeps communications. Whatever influence observers imagined, the reality of prison is blunt. The institution controls your schedule, your phone calls, your visits. Joey did his time, kept a public silence the courts require, and waited. When he came home in 2011, the city had changed, and so had he. He transitioned through a halfway house and moved south to Florida. Sunshine, new restaurants, and a life removed from the corners that made his name offered a different pace. Reporters still looked for him. People in Delray Beach and Boca Raton recognized him from TV and asked for photos. He found work in hospitality, greeting guests and keeping a gracious front-of-house rhythm. He told anyone who asked that he was retired from the life prosecutors had mapped for jurors years earlier. The conditions of supervised release were strict. No guns, no drugs, no contact with felons, limited travel, regular reporting. Federal probation officers keep close watch on high-profile defendants, and he was as high-profile as they come. Old ties are difficult to avoid, and in 2014 he was brought back before a judge for violating supervised release. The issue was contact with people who, like him, had felony records. In the federal system, that's prohibited unless you have permission. He admitted the breach, served a short return to custody, and came back out emphasizing that he understood the rules. The episode showed how narrow the line was for a man whose social circle included childhood friends who later acquired criminal records. Staying in bounds required vigilance and a willingness to walk away from reunions that once felt as casual as a Sunday dinner. 2 years later, his name surfaced again in a sweeping federal case out of Manhattan that bundled defendants from several states. The government dubbed it an East Coast enterprise, a catch-all indictment that covered gambling, loan sharking, and a healthcare fraud scheme that prosecutors said used pain cream prescriptions to bill insurers. Joey was one of the most recognizable people arrested. Agents picked him up in Florida. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bond with strict conditions, including limitations on travel and communications. The press conference announcing the charges had the usual cadence: charts, solemn promises to keep pursuing organized crime, and a list of counts that filled pages. That case turned into another showcase of the modern toolkit: cooperators wearing wires, informants ingratiating themselves with targets while recording calls and meetings, and text messages that prosecutors said captured plans. Defense lawyers argued that the witnesses were trying to save themselves, that their lures were clumsy, and that casual boasts recorded out of context became proof of crimes never carried out. When Joey's portion of the case went to trial in early 2018, the jury heard about sports betting and the pain cream plan. His lawyers said he wasn't part of any medical scheme, that he didn't run some coast-spanning crew, and that if he took bets, it was small-scale and not a federal conspiracy. After days of deliberation, jurors could not agree on the bulk of the charges against him, producing a hung jury. A retrial would have meant months more in court. Instead, he entered a plea to a single count related to illegal gambling. That put the long New York case to rest. He did not admit to being part of a larger criminal organization. The judge sentenced him to 2 years. He served time, and then moved into home confinement as the federal system adapted to public health pressures that affected prison populations across the country. When he came off that sentence, he returned to Florida again, still watched by cameras, still trailed by his reputation, still answering the same core question: what exactly was he now? Through those years, one constant remained: his insistence that he wasn't who the government insisted he was. Interviews showed a man who could be genial and needling at once, praising Philadelphia's sports teams, reminiscing about family gatherings, and swatting away any attempt to label him a boss. He still drew crowds at charity events. Parents handed him their phones for quick pictures. He smiled easily, an image at odds with the way prosecutors had described him in court filings. That contrast kept him in the news even when he was doing ordinary things: eating at a cafe, walking a beach, stopping by a friend's gathering. The neighborhoods where his legend began also evolved. Younger families moved in. Old-timers kept their routines. The city's law enforcement posture never softened. Organized crime units still monitored gambling, loan sharking, and public corruption, and federal prosecutors never stopped reminding the public that economic crimes harm more than balance sheets. The story of Joey Merlino became a lens through which the city looked at itself. The fine line between community pride and myths that hold you back, the cost of loyalty when it collides with the law, and the way public figures, whether athletes, politicians, or reputed mobsters, carry a piece of the city's identity. In recent seasons, he stepped into the media world directly, dipping into podcasting and social channels where he could speak without a reporter's filter. That move turned the spotlight into something he could control. On camera, he talked about sports, food, neighborhood memories, and occasionally brushed against the old questions without indulging them. He used his nickname, the one that newspapers splashed for years, and played against type, softer, more reflective, a man who had absorbed the consequences of his past and wanted to talk about something else. Law enforcement still paid attention, but the content leaned lifestyle, not instruction. It fit the monetization era clean language, no sensational detail, plenty of nostalgia. Even with distance and years, the same opposing narratives endure. Prosecutors point to convictions, plea agreements, supervised release violations, and the infrastructure of gambling and collecting that courts have recognized. Joey points to acquittals, the limits of what jurors accepted, and his right to move on. Both are true in their own ways. The record is the record. A racketeering conviction in 2001, a gambling plea in 2018, a return to custody at times for violating release conditions. The man is the man. A South Philadelphia son who never stopped seeing himself as a neighbor first, who leaned into visibility rather than hiding, who continues to live under the weight of a reputation he says doesn't fit. What remains compelling, even to people who never followed a single hearing, is how the story reflects on a place. Philadelphia knows how to argue with itself. It also knows how to change slowly while insisting nothing changes at all. Joey's path shows both truths. He built a persona that dazzled and provoked. He stood through 2 high-profile federal cases that ended with mixed results. He did significant time and came home to a different life in a different state. Yet every time he steps onto a sidewalk in South Philly, phones still tilt, and people still wonder if they are seeing the last headline of a fading era, or a man who outlasted predictions and transformed his fame into something less dangerous and more marketable. That question keeps the cameras on, even as the city's heartbeat moves to new rhythms. By the time he settled into Florida's sun, the years of courtrooms and headlines had turned into a rhythm he could hold at arm's length. Mornings meant coffee, a brisk walk, and a drive to a hospitality job where he greeted guests with the same polish he once used outside courthouses. People recognized him from TV. Some asked for a photo. He obliged with a quick smile, careful not to linger with anyone who might complicate the rules that followed him. Probation officers checked calendars, call logs, even social circles. For a man whose friends from childhood had felony records of their own, a simple hello could trigger a violation. He learned to read a room, to excuse himself early, to live within boundaries that were both legal and intensely personal. He called that retirement. Prosecutors preferred reputation management. Either way, the spotlight never really left. The long stretch he had already served left fingerprints on everything. After the 2001 racketeering conviction, he had gone into the federal system for years, aging there while his city changed in fits and starts. Those who spoke to him during that time remember routines that steadied the mind weights, laps, card games, watching local teams when the TV room allowed it. He stayed updated on his neighborhood through letters and visits, heard who got married, who moved, which block club still put out folding chairs when the weather turned nice. He did not talk about cases. He never stepped toward cooperation. In that world, silence is not just a stance. It's an identity you carry in every yard and chow hall you pass through. When he moved to a halfway house near the end, he could taste home. But home had shifted. South Philly was filling with new faces and coffee shops. The old guard still wore deep grooves into the sidewalks, yet the tempo felt different. His father's legacy never left the picture. Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino had been a high-ranking figure under Nicky Scarfo and drew a long federal sentence after the sweeping Scarfo-era prosecutions. The elder Merlino's conviction in 1988 set in motion a cascade of consequences for the family. Years later, he died while still in custody. That loss sat alongside everything else, another reminder that the life prosecutors described extracts a price spread over decades. For Joey, the grief came mixed with the reality that both the worst and best parts of his story were knotted up with a last name that opened doors even as it closed options. If the 1,990 seconds had made him a household figure in Philadelphia Christmas giveaways for kids, parades, news crews tracking his footsteps, the 2010 seconds pulled him into a quieter orbit. He moved south, chose dining rooms over street corners, and insisted he was done with what the government said he once did. He worked the front of house in restaurants, a natural fit for someone who understood hospitality and public curiosity. He made conversation about sports, food, family. The simple act of shaking hands became a performance, each decision filtered through conditions of supervised release. No firearms, no drugs, no unsanctioned contact with felons, no travel without permission, regular check-ins. In 2014, he was called back to court for an association breach. He admitted the violation and served a short return to custody. For outsiders, it looked minor. For him, it was a stark lesson. The difference between freedom and a cell could be a casual meetup at a friend's table. Then came the sweeping case built out of New York in 2016, which prosecutors branded an East Coast enterprise. It bundled defendants from several states, named well-known figures from different families, and read like a map of old neighborhoods and updated revenue streams, sports betting, loan sharking, and a separate healthcare fraud plan that involved expensive pain creams billed to insurers. Joey was arrested in Florida and pleaded not guilty. At the press conference, officials stood behind easels and talked about bringing pressure to bear on a network that still tried to steer money with threats and coded talk. He was released on bond with terms that once again narrowed his world. Curfew, monitored travel, no unsanctioned meetings, routine reporting. That case turned into a window on modern investigations. An insider, already cooperating with the FBI, recorded calls and meetings for months. Jurors would later hear fragments from restaurants, cars, and phone lines, a mosaic of bets, debts, and the pitch for medical products. Prosecutors said the tapes showed coordination and intent. The defense argued that the conversations were braggadocio, that the cooperating witness coaxed targets into loose talk, and that references clipped from longer chats misrepresented what people actually did. The alleged healthcare fraud drew special attention because it was of a different flavor than headline rackets of the past. It relied on prescriptions, compounding pharmacies, insurers' rules, less street muscle, more paperwork. Joey's lawyers told the jury he wasn't part of that scheme, that prosecutors overreached by folding his name into an umbrella theory of a multi-city organization that he didn't run. When deliberations stalled, the court declared a mistrial on most counts. Facing a potential retrial, Joey entered a plea to one gambling count, putting the broader fight to rest without admitting membership in a larger enterprise. The judge imposed a 2-year term. He served inside, then moved to home confinement as the federal system adjusted to the public health crisis that changed prison operations nationwide. Upon release, he returned to Florida again, older now, still public, yet eager to direct the spotlight to safer ground. He leaned into sports banter, neighborhood memories, and the small theater of everyday life. It had the feel of a rebrand that didn't deny history but refused to live in it. Back in Philadelphia, the conversation about organized crime had also shifted. Into the 2000s and 2010 seconds, federal cases targeted officials and contractors in public corruption probes, and the mob story took up less front-page space. When it did surface, it often came with a tone of old business trying to stay quiet. Prosecutors still pursued gambling and loan sharking conspiracies when they could. Grand juries still heard from bookmakers and debtors. There were acquittals and mistrials as well, signs that juries weigh these cases carefully. That the era of automatic convictions, based solely on reputation, has expired. Within that context, Joey's name remained magnetic because it signified a turning point in the city's history. The transition from the brutal Scarfo years to a media-savvy generation and, eventually, a less public, business-like approach attributed to others. What's documented and what's rumored live side by side in stories like his, so sticking to the public record matters. On paper, the crimes that attach to his name through verdicts and pleas are clear. Racketeering conspiracy in 2001 with underlying acts that included illegal gambling and extortion as jurors accepted them, plus a later guilty plea to a gambling offense in 2018. He violated supervised release once by associating with people barred by his conditions and returned to custody for that. He was never convicted of murder. Jurors rejected those most severe allegations 2 decades ago. Prosecutors nonetheless have long maintained that violence, even when not charged to a verdict, supplied the implicit backdrop for collecting debts in the early years. He has rejected that narrative from the start. Both Strand's convictions that are part of the record, denials that he repeats define the contours of his public life. Even after the later case ended, federal agents kept a cautious eye on his movements, a standard posture for any high-profile figure, with a long history of contact with the justice system. He adjusted by choosing very public spaces for socializing, places with cameras, plenty of witnesses, little room for private talk. He told curious admirers he was into hospitality and sports chatter now, not business. When podcasts and social platforms became the new corner, he stepped onto that block too. Short videos showed him needling friends about football, trading comments with followers, laughing off barbs. It was part image control, part entertainment. The next evolution of a relationship with an audience he never really lost. Clips stayed clean, free of the kind of language that would bring trouble, mindful of platform's rules. The question of leadership never really goes away in coverage about him. Reporters ask whether he still answers to anyone or whether anyone answers to him. Law enforcement avoids biographies, preferring to talk about conduct. Bets taken, payments made, threats hinted at, meetings recorded. People in the neighborhood offer a third version. They'll say he's a relic of a different tempo, someone who can't walk down 9th Street without being asked for a selfie but not the person behind every whisper. In his replies, he leans on the same line he used at the courthouse steps years earlier. Retired, enjoying life. Leave me out of your theory. After so many cases, he knows the language of denial, the care it takes to say only what you intend to say, nothing more. What the record also shows is how personal reinvention requires patience. For every public smile, there's paperwork, probation visits, random checks, travel approvals. He learned new habits, like steering conversations toward sports and restaurants instead of neighborhood gossip that could be read the wrong way. He kept appearances brief when old faces tried to linger. He said no to trips that would have felt automatic back in the day. He grew comfortable with the idea that he could be watched and still live without letting that fact hollow the day. That balance, being visible without giving anyone cause, became a skill as valuable to him as any he had learned in his earlier life. Friends sometimes note that he never stopped loving Philadelphia, even from a distance. He attributes his poise to growing up on its blocks, listening to its debates, living with both pride and scrutiny. When the Eagles or Phillies catch fire, he lights up on camera like any other fan calling into a radio show. That ordinary side makes the extraordinary parts of his story feel even more striking. He is both the courtroom photograph splashed in a headline and the guy at a cafe arguing about a bullpen. It's why, even now, a sighting of him can spark neighborhood talk that carries down an entire row of stoops. There's also the reality that his story doubles as a civic mirror. You can trace policy shifts through it, how prosecutors build modern cases, how judges view cooperators, how juries respond to narratives that mix old codes with new schemes. You can see how neighborhoods absorb notoriety, turn it into folklore, and eventually outgrow it. And you can watch how a man ages inside that cycle, first the brash figure at parades, then the defendant, then the inmate, then the host at the front of a restaurant, then the guy cracking jokes into a phone camera, while reminding viewers he's not that person anymore. What comes next is less about indictments than about time. He is in his 60s now, a stage when many people choose steadiness over risk. He has served significant federal time, carried the glare of 1,000 cameras, and outlasted predictions that he would either vanish or escalate. The charges attached to his name are established in court files. The allegations that never led to convictions remain allegations. The man talking on camera today sounds like someone who knows the difference and guards it. He keeps the language clean, the topics safe, the setting respectable. If his past was a tug between celebrity and liability, his present tries to ease that tension, to let the neighborhood memories survive without pulling him back into the cycle that gave them heat in the first place. Philadelphia will decide how to remember him. Some will point to the toy drives and holiday meals that softened his image in the 1,990 seconds, saying he kept a sense of community even when accusations swirled. Others will point to the dockets and say the story is right there in black and white. He has no control over that debate, only over what he does today. So he keeps walking into dining rooms, posing for pictures, answering sports questions, and insisting he's moved on. After decades in which others told his story for him, detectives, prosecutors, reporters, he has found a way to narrate parts of it himself, in his voice, on his timeline. Whether you believe him or not depends on which part of the record you trust. What no one disputes is that he remains one of Philadelphia's most recognizable sons, a man whose name still draws a crowd, whose past is documented, and whose present is a carefully tended performance of distance from what made him famous. He learned to move through days without letting the past speak for him, yet the past kept appearing in small, persistent ways. A stranger would stop him for a photograph and call him by the nickname the press made famous. A radio host in Philadelphia would drop his name while talking about old South Philly, as if the city's whole memory lived in one person. He never hid from any of it. He smiled, stayed polite, and answered as little as possible. There is a difference between avoiding a question and dodging the truth. He understood that line. The record, after all, is public. Trials, verdicts, supervised release papers, later arrests, and a plea tied to gambling. The rest, the myth, the personality, the swagger people still talk about, belongs to the noise that trails anyone who spends years in headlines. In federal court, the most important battles of his life didn't look dramatic. Rows of jurors, binders on tables, agents narrating short tapes. One of those trials turned on the voice of a former ally. Ralph Natale decided to cooperate and testified that the younger set around South Philly moved money through gambling and collections, with orders and permissions flowing through a small circle that included Joey. Defense lawyers challenged him without relenting, arguing that the timeline misfired, that grudges shaped recollection, that a man trading testimony for possible leniency had every reason to enlarge stories and shade motives. Cross-examination is usually not fireworks. It is repetition, until inconsistencies reveal themselves. Jurors watched that tug and weighed it against records recovered from bookmakers and conversations that sounded like business, even when no one said the most direct words aloud. Another insider wore a recording device during late 1990 seconds meetings, collecting pieces of talk that investigators later arranged into a narrative. Who handled bets? Who carried messages? How numbers settled? Those recordings became a backbone for the racketeering conspiracy that reached court at the end of the decade. Prosecutors emphasized structure and continuity. The defense pointed to friendship, bragging, and the way coded language can seem criminal when interpreted with a heavy thumb on the scale. Both sides told jurors to trust common sense. In the end, the panel gave a split result. It accepted that a criminal conspiracy existed during a span of years, and that Joey played a role in illegal gambling and extortion as the law defines them. It rejected the most severe accusations that would have connected him to killings from the worst parts of the early 1990 seconds feud. That pattern guilt on business crimes, acquittals on homicides, locked in his reputation as someone who lived between two competing portraits. Sentencing brought a term that ran well into the next decade. Judges weigh the jury's verdict, federal guidelines, leadership assessments, and the particular harm Congress says certain crimes cause. When the number arrived, it signaled that the court believed the case's core. Appeals did not erase it. He went away, not for months, but for years. The kind of absence that resets a life. People around him say he treated prison like a long, punishing job. Keep a routine, work out, keep your head down. Do not let gossip write your days. He followed teams on television when he could. He collected news about South Philly from letters and visits. Time takes on a different shape inside. You count not only birthdays and holidays, but little markers like which team got a new coach, which corner changed its storefronts, which relative moved across the bridge to a quieter suburb. Even while he was in a federal unit, his name kept moving. Reporters revisited the war in the early 1990 seconds, listing moments that shocked the city. A brazen attack on an expressway, a friend lost to gunfire during the feud, another veteran left with grave injuries that changed families forever. They tied those events to the prosecutions that followed. They noted that jurors let the homicide claims fall away and still punished a business model the government had mapped as gambling, loan sharking, and the use of fear to enforce debts. The coverage rarely needed adjectives. Philadelphia had lived the story once. Repeating the details in cautious language was enough to bring back the feeling. His father's story ended behind a different set of federal walls. Salvatore Chucky Merlino had been part of the Scarfo years and fell with that regime when the government won sweeping convictions in the late 1982. He died in custody years later. That loss cut through everything else. Father and son had lived through overlapping trials, prison transports, visits hemmed in by rules. And then one of those lives ended without a homecoming. For Joey, it was a private grief that confirmed a public truth. A certain path extracts a price, no matter the charisma, no matter how many neighbors ask for a photo at a street fair. When he came home after serving the racketeering sentence, he did not return to row house blocks full-time. He headed south. Florida's pace offered distance and a kind of daylight he could not get in Philadelphia. He found work in dining rooms, an environment where every detail counts. A name remembered, a chair pulled, a laugh at the right moment. He seemed to enjoy the role. Hospitality lets a person who knows how to read a crowd turn that skill into a paycheck. It also keeps you in public, where eyes and phones create a kind of built-in accountability. He told anyone who asked that he had retired from the life prosecutors had described years earlier. The formal conditions of supervised release enforced that promise no guns, no drugs, limits on who he could meet, check-ins that arrive without warning. Supervised release violations can be small in the eyes of outsiders and huge under the rules. In 2014, he admitted to contact with people barred by his conditions and returned to custody for a short stretch. It was an administrative fall, not a new indictment, but it underscored how narrow his lane had to be. Old friends from the neighborhood often carried felony records of their own, and even an innocent conversation can cause a problem when your paperwork says no unsanctioned associations. He learned to leave gatherings early, to say hello in passing and keep walking, to treat a simple lunch like a risk if the seating chart looked wrong. Then came another major probe, this time out of New York. The 2016 case bundled defendants from several cities and framed the allegations as an East Coast enterprise featuring gambling, loan sharking, and a separate effort to profit from healthcare billing through pain cream prescriptions filled at compounding pharmacies. Joey was arrested in Florida and pleaded not guilty. He was a headline name in a long press conference that promised to strike a blow against old names adapting to new schemes. Release on bond followed, with restrictions that echoed his past. Monitored travel, curfews, limited contact, a reminder that words on a phone can become evidence when the other voice works for the government. The case rested heavily on recordings. A cooperator gathered hours of talk at tables, in cars, and over phones. Prosecutors said those tapes showed coordination, the settling of bets, the nudge and wink language that indicates obligations and leverage. Joey's lawyers replied that the witness pushed subjects toward incriminating chatter, that the healthcare fraud discussion did not reflect his client's actions, and that what remained at most was small-scale wagering not intended to be part of a grand conspiracy. Jurors listened, took notes, and ended up stuck on much of it. A mistrial meant the government could try again. Instead, Joey chose to plead to one gambling count and put the rest down. The court imposed a 2-year term. He served the sentence, in part during a moment when public health concerns reshaped federal custody, and then returned to clockwork routines under supervision once more. By then, the city that made him a constant topic had shifted again. A new wave of restaurants filled blocks once known for clubs with low lights and back rooms. Old-timers still gathered on stoops, but the talk had less to do with who met where and more to do with rising rents and which bakery changed its recipe. He remained a curiosity whenever he visited. People asked for pictures. He obliged. He gave little. The old pose, friendly, non-committal, alert, never left him. Reporters kept him on speed dial. He rarely answered. Time has its own way of changing a person's tone. The bravado of youth gives way to something calmer when the list of court dates behind you is longer than the calendar in front of you. He also stepped into the online world to manage the narrative directly. Short videos featured him trading sports takes, talking about hoagies and Sunday gravy, complimenting local places, and generally refusing to step anywhere near the questions prosecutors chased for years. It was part performance and part protection. Keep content clean, keep remarks light, keep the focus on safe ground. If someone tried to steer him into the old topics in comments or during a live segment, he brushed it off with a line about being retired and enjoying life. He had learned to let silence work for him when silence mattered. and to let charm fill the space when a crowd simply wanted a familiar face smiling into a camera. Those who follow organized crime history in Philadelphia see his arc as a hinge between eras. The Scarfo period set one-tone bloody headlines: fear, an onslaught of federal pressure. The 1,990 seconds opened a struggle between older leadership and a brash younger set, with skirmishes that made the front page and a media-savvy figure at the center of attention, whether he asked for it or not. The 2000s saw quieter leadership credited to others, and a series of cases that stressed business crimes over public street theater. Through all of it, Joey's name stayed central in public memory because he managed to be both visible and elusive, smiling in open air while insisting he was miscast by prosecutors and misunderstood by people hungry for a story. Ask 10 people in South Philly what he represents, and you will hear 10 answers. Some point to charity drives around the holidays, the way he posed with kids, and stepped into the role of neighborhood patron at a time when the city wanted reasons to believe its roughest corners still belonged to families first. Others point to court dockets and say the verdicts tell you everything you need to know. He does not control that debate. He controls how he carries himself. In that sense, the adult version of him, older, more watchful, publicly devoted to everyday pleasures, looks very different from the figure who once treated news cameras as if they were part of the scenery. The difference is not in the smile. It is in how brief the moment lasts before he moves along. He has spent much of his life pushing back on a single word: boss. Prosecutors used it. Journalists repeated it. He rejected it over and over, calling himself a regular guy with a high profile and bad luck. The truth jurors accepted about him sits in the record: racketeering conspiracy with underlying acts linked to gambling and extortion. Years later, a plea to a gambling offense, a supervised release violation for contact he was not allowed to make. The accusations that would have defined him as something far darker were put in front of a jury and did not become convictions. That is where the line falls. Even if arguments about what really happened will keep talk shows busy as long as people want to relive old feuds. In the end, what endures is a study in contrast. He came from a family tied to one of the city's most notorious stretches, embraced the public in a way few in that world ever had, lost verdicts that carried real time, beat charges that would have closed the book, left town for a while, then built a new daily life inside rules he knew could send him back if he blinked. He can still draw a crowd without raising his voice. He can still set off a debate without saying a word. He no longer looks eager for either. The city that once defined him has changed, and so has the man. What remains is the careful balance he chose in the years after his last case. Stay visible enough to own your name. Stay quiet enough to keep the peace you earned the hard way. He carried on with a routine built to leave little room for mistakes. Morning coffee, a workout, a quick scroll through sports scores, then a shift where he shook hands and remembered names. Conversation came easy. He talked about coaches, the state of a bullpen, the way a city feels when football goes deep into January. That light touch kept eyes away from the topics that had swallowed years. Curiosity never fades, though. People who recognized him would lean in and ask how Philadelphia was doing, whether he missed the old blocks, if he ever thought about moving back. He would say the same thing every time. He loved his hometown, he visited, but he was settled where the sun made each day softer, and the calendar felt less like a set of court dates. His public image had been built in two places that normally don't mix: a courthouse and a neighborhood festival. That paradox held all through his return to civilian life. The legal record stayed fixed. He had a racketeering conspiracy conviction tied to gambling and extortion as jurors accepted them. And years later, he pleaded to a gambling offense in New York after a jury couldn't agree on most charges. He had a supervised release violation for contact, barred by his conditions, and served a short stretch for it. He was never convicted of homicide. A jury rejected those accusations long ago. Reporters summarized that package whenever his name re-entered the news, and he didn't try to rewrite it. He focused on what came next. Staying within the rules, keeping conversations clean, leaning on charm without letting it cause trouble. The internet gave him a new stage that he could control. Short clips let him choose the subject and the tone. He stuck to teams, food, and neighborhood stories that made people smile. Viewers wanted the old lore. He shooed that aside and kept the talk safe. A name that once arrived in headlines next to words like indictment and trial now sat above videos where he debated quarterbacks and gave restaurant recommendations. The irony was not lost on anyone. For years, others narrated him. Now he could narrate himself. The trick was to do it without crossing lines set by judges and probation officers, and to do it without baiting the kinds of arguments that lead to confused quotes and fresh headlines. Even as he tried to live forward, the past hovered in the form of books and documentaries that revisited the era when Philadelphia's underworld struggled with itself. Cooperators wrote memoirs. One of those books, by an older figure who had turned witness, described him as a day-to-day force in the 1,990 seconds before the big case landed. He dismissed that portrayal as self-serving, a version crafted to justify deals. He didn't go page by page in public. He hadn't done that at trial either. He preferred to say that verdicts and pleas tell you what's real and what isn't. The jury's split decision years earlier remained his strongest defense against the harshest labels. Prosecutors had argued a sweeping narrative. Jurors clipped it to what the government could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. South Philadelphia had moved on in visible ways. Blocks gained new cafes and younger families. Time softened the old edges, even as memories stayed sharp for those who lived through the feud that once made daily life feel precarious. He returned for occasional visits, funerals, family gatherings, a quick stop for a sandwich, and each appearance turned into a makeshift receiving line. Phones came out. People asked for a smile. The city that can be tough on its own also has a way of embracing characters who carry a piece of its story, even complicated ones. He didn't indulge that nostalgia for long. He kept visits brief, stayed in open places, and left before anybody could claim a private meeting happened in a quiet corner. Law enforcement never stopped watching organized crime, even when the cases grew quieter. Investigators shifted tactics as the economy changed. Digital bets replaced paper slips. Payments moved through apps and code words instead of envelopes left under a counter. The basic pattern federal prosecutors described for decades: wagering, debt collection. Pressure didn't vanish so much as it adapted to technology. He became a case study in how someone with a past tries to live among those changes without getting pulled into them. He took care to put distance between himself and the devices or rooms where casual talk can be recorded. If a topic felt risky, he cut it off. If a face in a room looked like it might cause a problem, he found a reason to be somewhere else. Years inside left him with a seasoned understanding of how quickly life can flip. That showed in small choices. Never letting a conversation drift when a joke could redirect it, always keeping his schedule visible so probation had no reason to suspect secrecy, choosing work that put him in front of witnesses rather than behind closed doors. Living in public can feel like a burden. For him, it became a shield. Hospitality is predictable, and predictable was the point. Courts demand it from people with high-profile records. He embraced the limits because the alternative was too familiar: a cell, a yard, and a clock that refuses to move. The story of the 1,990 seconds still drew scholars, reporters, and podcast hosts who wanted context. They asked how internal conflicts escalated, who made which call, and how a war that shook the city ended with courtroom charts instead of backroom truces. The safest way to answer was to point them to the record. A younger faction rose, while older hands tried to keep control. Loud acts drew loud attention. Law enforcement put microphones where it could, followed money, leaned on insiders who decided that testimony beat a lifetime in a federal unit. Trials came, and juries made hard distinctions. Business crimes proved. The worst violence, not. He didn't try to interpret that era. He had lived it. He let the public documents carry the explanation, and let others debate what it meant for a city trying to outgrow a long shadow. As time passed, he found that the simplest routines mattered most. Shared meals with family, calls that ended with jokes rather than coded language, walks where he could nod to neighbors without staying long enough to turn a sidewalk into an event. If you had told the brash version of him from the 1,990 seconds that restraint would become his favorite tool, he might have laughed. Age teaches its own lessons. Love of place does too. He wanted to be able to visit South Philly whenever he felt like it, to stand near a market stall and argue about cheese without seeing a headline 5 hours later that turned a stroll into a summit. That wish required care, and he exercised it. The way newspapers described him changed as well. Early coverage showed a young man smiling for cameras, and flipping conventional wisdom about laying low. Middle years put his name inside long trial stories about RICO law, cooperators, and sentencing guidelines. Later pieces treated him as a figure from another time, a symbol of a city that once wrestled publicly with its underworld. When he appeared in new cases, it was often as one item in a broader indictment rather than the central story. That shift felt like an indicator of both personal and institutional change. He was no longer the daily focus, and prosecutors were just as likely to talk about cyber fraud or public corruption as they were about old-school street economies. One constant through all of it was his refusal to accept titles. He rejected every label that implied command. Prosecutors continued to speak in terms of roles and structure, because that is how federal conspiracy cases are built. He responded by pointing to acquittals on the most serious counts and narrowing the discussion to what jurors had actually found. That distinction mattered to him, and it matters to any fair telling. The public can argue about what it believes. The legal system is more precise. On paper, his record lists particular crimes proved in court, and others that were alleged but not sustained. He lives by that line in conversation, and he steers interviews back to it whenever someone tries to expand the frame. He also grew comfortable with the idea that he could contribute something positive without pretending the past didn't exist. Holiday events in the 1990 seconds had built an image of a neighborhood figure who made sure kids had toys and families had meals. In later years, he kept his charitable gestures less theatrical and more practical. A quiet check here, a favor called in for someone's job interview, a social media boost for a small business that needed customers. None of that erased the record. It didn't try to. It simply reflected a choice. If you carry a famous name, use it to help, rather than to stir old fires. The broader city story continued to evolve. New leaders in law enforcement emphasized prevention and community outreach alongside prosecution. Neighborhood associations took on roles that once belonged to informal power brokers. The same streets that had hosted whispered meetings now hosted block parties with permits and food trucks. He watched those changes with a mixture of relief and nostalgia. He loved the old rituals, but he understood why people wanted something different to define them. He had become a benchmark, a way to measure how far the city had traveled. You can only play that role by being around long enough to see it. His age also brought a different kind of patience. At 60 plus, he knew that racking up fresh confrontations would only confirm the worst assumptions about him. He preferred quieter victories, another year with no violations, another season of greeting diners and leaving work with a clean conscience, another trip north where the only thing anyone could report was that he smiled for pictures and tipped well. That unflashy path lacks drama, which is exactly why it works. Drama is what feeds headlines, and headlines have a way of becoming exhibits in a courtroom. Every so often, someone would approach him with a pitch for a show, a book, a dramatization. He passed more than he accepted. Ownership of the narrative tempted him, but he knew that control can be an illusion once cameras start rolling. The versions of his life that play best on a screen need villains and heroes, and he didn't want to be cast as either. Better, he thought, to let smaller platforms carry a simpler message. Talk about sports. Offer a story about a market stand from childhood. Leave the rest to historians and lawyers who could argue without dragging him back into their forum. Looking back on the long sweep childhood in a neighborhood where his father's name meant something, the turbulence of the 1990 seconds, the long federal stretch, the return to a lighter daily grind, he saw a thread that tied everything together. Visibility. He had never disappeared, for better or worse. That visibility once made him a target for both rivals and investigators. In later years, it became part of his defense. There is a certain logic in saying, "You can see where I am, every day. If I were doing what you think, I wouldn't be doing it here." It isn't a legal argument, but it resonates with people who watched him turn a public life into a protective shell. The final adjustment came from within. He let himself enjoy small things without suspicion: morning light on a sidewalk, a perfect plate of pasta, a good joke told at his expense. He kept a circle of friends who understood boundaries and didn't ask him to test them. He was still Joey to people who grew up alongside him. Still the guy a neighborhood might gather around for a picture. Still the man whose past is written in court files. But he was also a person who had learned to appreciate a quiet drive and a night without his phone lighting up. In that quiet, he found the distance he had been chasing since the first day cameras learned his stride. He woke most mornings before the sun and let the quiet do its work. A jog along flat streets, a stretch, a check on scores from the late games. The phone stayed face down until coffee was gone. Old habits teach you how to survive attention. Set your own tempo. Keep your circle small. Never let someone else decide how your day starts. Florida fit that plan. He liked the pace, the heat, the routine of welcoming guests and making a dining room feel warm. People came in smiling and left the same way. That was the point. He still got recognized. Someone would whisper, then angle for a friendly hello. He obliged with a grin and a few lines about the Phillies or the Eagles. The talk stayed in safe lanes. Outside, palm fronds waved. Inside, the calendar moved along without court dates marking the weeks. Finishing the 2-year sentence from the New York case meant more than a gate opening. It meant trying to rebuild trust with a system that had kept him on a short leash for most of his adult life. Home confinement during a national health crisis forced a slower kind of patience. He filled the hours with exercise, reading, long calls with family, and the kind of quiet that once felt like punishment, but now felt like a reset. The rules were familiar. Scheduled check-ins, restrictions on travel, limitations on who he could meet. He took them seriously. He had learned the hard way that a casual meetup with the wrong person can bend an ordinary afternoon into a violation. When the last day of supervision arrived, it wasn't a party. It was a pause, then the same deliberate pace, because habits built under pressure can be more reliable than freedom's rush. In that stretch, he began to use the internet differently. Social media had already become a town square for every neighborhood in America, including the old blocks where his name still stirs strong opinions. He posted short videos that kept to comfortable ground. A prediction about Sunday's game, a restaurant he liked, a memory that made people laugh without stirring old heat. He answered the clean questions and let the rest roll by. When strangers tried to bait him into talking about the cases, he passed. He said he was retired from that story and meant it. The platforms have rules, and so did he. Keep language clean. Avoid any hint of threats or swagger. Show enough personality to remind people who you are. Never let a clip become a courtroom exhibit. People joked that he should sell pics on football and basketball. He teased a pic now and then, like a neighbor who leans over the fence with a wink. It was performance more than business, a way to connect without crossing into anything that would make headlines for the wrong reasons. Fans played along, tailing or fading his opinions for fun. The exchanges came with a tone you only get in cities that love their teams like family. There were no big speeches about redemption, just small, steady signals that a man can live in public without feeding the worst versions of his own story. Invitations arrived from radio shows, podcasts, and documentary crews. Some he accepted. Many he declined. The ones he did took on a familiar shape, a host with questions about the old days, a guest who steered the conversation toward sports, food, and the way South Philly changed while he was away. If someone asked directly about charges that had once defined coverage of his name, he pointed to the record. The government told jurors a broad story. He was convicted of racketeering conspiracy anchored in illegal gambling and extortion, as the law defines those acts. He was acquitted of the worst allegations tied to the early 1992 feud. Years later, in New York, a jury deadlocked on most counts. He resolved that case with a guilty plea to a single gambling offense and served 2 years. He violated supervised release once for associating with people the rules barred, and did a short return to custody for it. Those are the facts you can look up. That is the line he drew. He didn't try to relitigate the rest with microphones. Philadelphia's interest in organized crime did not vanish, but it lost its central place in the city's daily rhythm. Smaller cases surfaced now and then, often focused on gambling and collection networks that look different in the digital era. Agents and prosecutors adapted to encrypted apps, online betting, and money that moves without bills changing hands. When reporters called to ask whether he had thoughts on shifting tactics, he waved them off and said he was out of that conversation. He had spent enough years inside to know that the best comment is silence when the subject is a world you claim to have left. Travel back to his old neighborhood became a ritual of discretion. He chose daylight, public places, and short windows. A funeral would bring him north. A family celebration would put him at a long table for exactly the time it takes to toast and hug and leave. On Ninth Street or Passyunk, passers-by would stop him for photos. He stood for them, smiled, and kept moving. He knew that a coffee on a corner could set off a chain of speculation that runs longer than any line at the market. He did not give anyone a reason to turn a hello into a headline. That kind of discipline is harder than bravado and more boring to watch, which is why it works. His father's absence traveled with him. Salvatore Chucky Merlino had gone down in the Scarfo-era prosecutions and never came home. The elder Merlino's fate is a fixed marker for anyone telling the story of how Philadelphia changed. It shows what the government's pressure can do and what choices can cost families on the inside and the outside. For Joey, the lesson landed with the finality only family can deliver. No matter how many times he told reporters he was misunderstood, the law had its own record with his last name on it, and one of the people who shaped his early life didn't live to see the city beyond concrete walls. He did not dwell on it in public, but you could hear the weight in the spaces between what he said and what he left unsaid. The 1,990 seconds remained the era most outsiders asked about. He handled those questions with the same careful phrasing. A younger group had pushed against older leadership. The conflict spilled into public view in ways that shook the city. Prosecutors later used cooperators, tapes, and ledgers to argue that a criminal enterprise ran gambling, loans, and collections through South Philadelphia and South Jersey. The jury accepted some of that case, rejected its darkest claims, and the judge delivered a sentence measured in years. He served, came home, violated supervised release once, and later faced the East Coast case in New York that ended in a plea to a gambling offense. That is the arc. Beyond it lie opinions, not verdicts. He will tell you opinions are not the same thing as proof. It's the closest thing to a speech he still makes. Aging gave him a new way to see the long stretch behind him. He had been a young man who smiled into cameras when most in his world ducked them. He had stood on courthouse steps trading quips while facing indictments that could have swallowed the rest of his life. He had done real federal time. He had come home into a city that changed while still arguing with its own reflection. He now tried to be the person who left a room without giving anyone an excuse to read motive into a handshake. That required resisting both the praise and the provocations. In South Philly, praise can be as dangerous as scorn, because both invite you to perform. He learned to do less of that. Scholars and students began to use his story as a case study. Journalism classes mapped how reporters cover long-running investigations without glamorizing them. Law courses explored how RICO cases lean on insiders and coded language. Sociology seminars asked what happens to neighborhoods when informal power structures meet formal institutions over decades. He did not sit in those rooms, but his name was on the syllabus. He had become, whether he liked it or not, a way to talk about a city's transition from an era of open street power to one of quieter, bureaucratic pressure, and eventually, everyday life returning to something closer to normal. Even with that distance, the old binary persisted. People lined up on two sides of a familiar argument. One group said his charitable gestures in the 1,990 seconds and his later hospitality work proved he was a neighborhood man at heart, someone who could have buried himself in shadows, but chose to be visible, accessible, and generous. The other group pointed to the racketeering conviction, the details of gambling and extortion accepted by a jury, the supervised release violation, and the later gambling plea as irrefutable evidence that the government's core claims were right. He did not try to settle the argument. He could only manage his conduct in the present tense. That, he figured, was enough of a job. There were moments, even recently, when his presence alone turned an ordinary scene into a minor spectacle. A ball game, a festival, a sidewalk table with plates of pasta. Phones lifted. Someone shouted his name like a chant. He understood the theater and refused to add lines. A wave, a joke. Then back to whatever conversation he had been having. To people who don't live in cities like Philadelphia, that behavior can look calculated. To anyone from the blocks where he grew up, it looks like survival with a smile. He stayed mindful of the technicalities that structure life after long cases. If a parole or probation condition said no contact with felons without permission, he treated a reunion request like a legal question, not a social one. If a reporter called with a leading question, he answered with a fact from the record or not at all. If a documentarian wanted him to reenact scenes, he declined. He knew that hindsight mixed with editing can make anyone look like the person a story needs. His own version required fewer edits. He was convicted of particular crimes and served the time. He was acquitted of the worst accusations from the early 1990 seconds. He later pleaded guilty to a gambling offense in New York. He says he is retired. Since then, his days revolve around family, hospitality, sports talk, and quiet. In a softer register, he also tried to use his footprint to nudge things in better directions. It wasn't showy. A fundraiser link shared to help a sick kid. A call placed to smooth a job interview for a neighbor's son. A word of encouragement for a small shop on a side street that needed traffic. He understood that none of it changes the past. He did it anyway because the present is where you can actually move the needle for someone else. He had once thrown Christmas events that drew television. Now he preferred favors that drew no cameras at all. Time can dim the sharpest images, but some still stand out in the city's collective memory. A high-speed ambush on a summer day. A funeral line that stretched around corners. The photo of a young man in sunglasses next to a headline that used the words "boss" and "war." He can't erase any of that. The most he can do is refuse to provide fresh versions. When asked about those scenes, he nods, lets the silence sit, and says that a jury did not convict him for those acts. He won't say more. It frustrates people who want a confession or an apology. It also keeps him from becoming the next lesson in how the past can pull you back if you stare too long. He has said, often and without drama, that he loves South Philadelphia in a way only someone raised there can understand. It sits in the sound of a street vendor's voice, in the smell rolling out of a bakery at dawn, in the argument over a sandwich that expands until it's really about family. He carries that love at a distance now. The move south gave him space to live without waking up to gossip columns guessing his next move. Distance gave him back ordinary days, and ordinary days are what people earn when they outlast noise. The last few years placed him in a new category, a public figure whose fame comes from a past he insists he's closed. He is not the first person to try that pivot, and he won't be the last. What makes his version notable is how steady he has kept it. He does not lash out at the prosecutors who won key verdicts against him. He does not chase the cameras that once chased him. He does not accept every attempt to cast him as a character in a familiar drama. He could. The offers swirl. He chooses not to. That choice only stands if he keeps making it every day. What remains are the parts of life that don't elicit headlines. Family dinners. A favorite seat at a cafe. The satisfaction of a shift done right. The quiet pride of watching a city you love evolve in ways that give the next generation a little less to fear and a little more to celebrate. He once walked into rooms and turned them into stories. Now he leaves rooms the way he found them. That might be the biggest change of all, and, for someone whose name still lights up conversations, the most surprising kind of peace. He had grown comfortable with a life that didn't need to announce itself. Up early, a jog along quiet streets, a quick glance at scores, a call to check on family, then a shift in a dining room where hospitality did the talking. If someone recognized him, the conversation started with sports or food and stayed there. He learned which questions belonged to strangers, which belonged to friends, and which should go unanswered. That kind of judgment is learned the slow way after indictments, after long sentences, after realizing that one careless conversation can put your name back on a docket. Florida gave him space to practice that restraint, and to prove, day after day, that ordinary life was not a cover but a choice. He tried a venture with his name over a door in South Florida, a restaurant that drew attention precisely because of the surname on the sign. He greeted guests, worked the front, signed menus, and played the role he knew well: host, storyteller, neighborhood guy in a new zip code. Local coverage followed every step, parsing whether he was truly in the business or simply a face who brought people through the door. Questions about licensing and compliance arrived fast, and the place didn't last. He shrugged and moved on. The lesson was simple. Any project with his name would be treated like a public event, so keep it clean, keep it brief, keep it clearly on the right side of the rules. Away from work, he kept visits to South Philadelphia short and straightforward. He flew in for family obligations, stood for photos on sidewalks everyone in the city knows by heart, and flew back out before anyone could suggest a private sit-down. He chose daylight and public places. He preferred a cafe table to a back room. If familiar faces with old records approached, he waved and kept drifting. After one supervised release violation years earlier for associating with people he wasn't allowed to meet, he never forgot how narrow a path could be. Even when those formal conditions expired, he carried the habit forward. It was both practical and symbolic. A way to show that distance wasn't a performance, it was policy. The big New York case that had named him in 2016 left a complicated trail. The indictment bundled defendants from several cities and described an East Coast operation that covered loans, gambling, and a scheme involving pain cream prescriptions billed to insurers. A cooperating witness brought hours of recordings, much of it sprinkled with coded language and braggadocio that prosecutors argued showed coordination. The defense attacked the witness's credibility, questioned oversight by agents, and told jurors that chatting over coffee isn't the same thing as running a racket. Deliberations stalled. A mistrial followed on most counts. Rather than endure a second round, he admitted a single gambling count, served 2 years, and left the rest behind. The takeaway for him was as blunt as a verdict. Live small, speak less, and treat caution as a daily discipline. Serving that sentence through the period when the federal system grappled with a public health crisis meant time split between a secure facility and home confinement. The monotony became a ritual exercise: reading, calls, careful schedules. When he was finally free of restrictions, he didn't swing back toward spectacle. He stayed in public view, just enough to make rumors hard to sustain, and quiet enough to avoid becoming anyone's fresh narrative. That balance, clear sightlines, and short conversations let him continue without baiting the same storm that had once followed his every move. He leaned more into the parts of his persona people could enjoy without controversy. Short clips online captured him recommending a plate of pasta, praising a deli, or breaking down Sunday's game with the enthusiasm of any lifer from a city that treats sports like family business. He kept the language clean, the topic safe, the tone light. Viewers tried to pull him toward the past. He wouldn't go. He repeated a line that had become familiar. The record speaks for itself. He's retired from that world, and he's focused on regular life. In a media age that rewards extremes, his restraint made its own kind of statement. It also fit the platform's rules and made his content brand safe: no profanity, no glorification of wrongdoing, nothing to trip a policy review. Old debates in Philadelphia never fully resolved, and they didn't need him to keep going. Crime reporters who had chronicled the Scarfo years and the younger faction's rise in the 1,990 seconds still fielded questions from viewers. New cases cropped up against people who had once stood near him on courthouse steps, underscoring that federal attention to gambling, extortion, and collection never vanished. Other figures faced indictments and later sentences. He wasn't part of those dockets. From Florida, he watched the cycle replay in muted tones. Charges, arraignments, plea talks, the grind of discovery, and stayed out of frame. It was an odd inversion. For years, he had been the headline. Now he was the question people asked around other headlines. Where is he? What's he doing? Is he still in the picture? His answer was the same: enjoying the sun, working, keeping the peace. He also understood that his name would always travel with parentheses: claims, denials, acquittals, convictions. The legal record is simple to list: a racketeering conspiracy conviction in the early 2000s, anchored in illegal gambling and extortion, as jurors understood those acts. Acquittals on homicide accusations from the early 1,990 seconds feud. A supervised release violation for prohibited association. A later guilty plea to a gambling offense in New York after a hung jury on broader counts. A 2-year sentence served. That's the spine of the story, according to public documents. The arguments on either side of those entries: prosecutors saying fear and forced debts, him saying they overreach still travel, but they don't change the list. He held on to that distinction because clarity protects him more than charisma ever did. People often wanted the why behind his choices, especially the decision to stay so visible in the 1,990 seconds when tradition demanded the opposite. He didn't volunteer a theory. Others did. Some said it was pride. Some said it was strategy. Some said it was the only way he knew to be. Whatever the reason, the visibility cut both ways. It made him a magnet for attention that prosecutors turned into evidence. but it also created a public image that didn't match the government's bleakest portrayal. Jurors are human. They watch the same nightly news as everyone else. When charges stretched into darker claims, the defense could point to a man who attended parades, hosted toy drives, and stood on sidewalks without disguises. That contrast didn't win every argument, but it kept the story complicated. In later years, he flipped the logic. Visibility became a guardrail. If your day happens in places with cameras and witnesses, there's less room for suspicion to grow. Notoriety has a way of fixing people in time. He fought that by aging in public, not as a headline, but as a person. He talked about cooking, family, the ache of missing old relatives at holiday tables. He praised young athletes coming up in Philadelphia and razzed rivals the way any fan would. He let his accent do some of the work. It's the sound of a place that can be blunt and affectionate in the same sentence. That voice reminded people he was more than a file of exhibits. He wasn't trying to win a campaign. He was trying to live without turning small moments into flashpoints. He also kept a certain faith with the city he left. Visits north often included a quiet stop to see someone who needed a hello more than he needed a picture. He did the basics: call about a job lead, send flowers after a loss, help a neighbor's business with a mention online. None of that erases the past, and he didn't pretend it did. But it allowed him to be part of the present tense in ways that didn't create new problems. After years where kindness became content, he preferred to move without fanfare and let the people on the receiving end do the talking if they chose. From the outside, law school seminars and journalism classes kept returning to the mechanics of the cases attached to his name. Students studied how racketeering law works, especially when a prosecution relies on insiders and coded talk. They debated the credibility of cooperators, the ethics of long-running undercover work, and the influence of media coverage on jury pools. His arc gave them material: an internal feud, a rebuild, a sweeping indictment, a mixed verdict, a long sentence, an eventual emergence into a different era, then a new case in a different city that sputtered before ending in a narrow plea. He didn't sit in those rooms, but his silhouette did. It served as a caution and a case study at the same time. He never stopped denying the label that trailed him boss. He deflected the title every time it surfaced. Prosecutors had their theories and their charts. He pointed to what jurors actually decided and what they rejected. That legal line meant more to him than any nickname a headline minted in the 1,990 seconds. The word that he accepted, maybe the only one he ever did, was neighbor. Even from Florida, he tried to keep that part alive by being approachable, by remembering names, by leaving a good tip, by making sure a room felt like a neighborhood more than a stage. Other names from Philadelphia's underworld history continued to appear in court filings through the 2010 seconds and early 2020 seconds. Agents targeted betting lines that had moved online, credit arrangements tracked by texts instead of notepads, and debt pressures that played out in subtler ways than the past once did. Some defendants took pleas. Others went to trial and tested the government's narrative. Sentences followed, measured in years rather than decades for many. While those developments unfolded, he stayed out of the filings. He became a reference point instead of a participant. Reporters could still call him for comment, but the news didn't need his quote to stand up. That's how eras change quietly, in courtrooms with fewer cameras and stakes that feel less like citywide events. Across all of this ran a thread of grief that he rarely discussed. His father died in custody, a fact that puts a period on certain arguments. There is no friendlier way to say it. The life the government describes takes a toll that spreads to families, to wives and children and parents, to those who wait outside visitation rooms and mark holidays on calendars that do not care how long any day feels. He didn't give speeches about that reality, but his careful tone when asked about the past suggested the lesson never left him. It showed in how quickly he stepped away from any situation that could drag him back toward a system that had already taken decades. He tried to model a different script for younger people who still saw glamour, where he saw courtrooms. The advice he gave was low-key, almost plain. Keep your head down, work an honest job, find a way to take pride in simple things. Coming from anyone else, it might sound basic. Coming from him, it carried the weight of experience carved into a life by judges and gatekeepers, and the slow churn of time. He did not pretend his earlier years didn't happen. He just refused to turn them into an instruction manual. Even the fun parts of his later routine watch parties, quick predictions, friendly arguments about lineups carried a layer of care. If someone tried to turn a sports conversation into a whisper about odds and numbers, he changed the topic or excused himself. He had learned that a half-joking quip can turn up as a quote in a complaint, and that a boast can become an exhibit. He didn't give anyone that leverage. He would rather debate whether a coach made the right call on fourth down than talk about anything that could be read as business. He aged into a man who understood both his appeal and its limits. People wanted to be around him for the story and the swagger, but they stayed for the manners. He held doors, remembered faces, asked after family, kept it light. That sounds small until you realize how many people in his orbit once turned every gathering into a test of hierarchy. He had done enough of that in another life. The new life asked for the opposite: humility and restraint, which are harder to fake and easier to see. The city he left has never quite let go of its fascination with men like him, and likely never will. Philadelphia remembers long, argues loudly, and forgives in complicated ways. His name still stirs all of that, but the tempo around him is slower now, the volume lower. That suits him. He would rather have a quiet meal and a laugh than a headline, and he built routines that make that outcome likely. He can't control what people say after he leaves a room, but he can control how little material he leaves them. Looking back, he sees a timeline divided into clear chapters. A childhood in a neighborhood where a surname mattered. A run through the 1,990 seconds, when media attention and internal conflict made his face familiar far beyond his zip code. A federal case that ended with guilty counts on business crimes and not guilty findings on the most severe allegations, followed by a long sentence. A period of adjustment under supervision, with one violation that sent him back for a bit. A second, splashy indictment years later in New York that concluded with a narrow gambling plea and 2 years served. Then a set of quieter years in the sun, with cameras still hovering but less to capture. Through it all, he held to a simple line. He is not who the government said he was. He is not a figure out of a movie. He is a neighborhood man who made mistakes and paid for them, who wants to be left alone to enjoy the rest of his life. What remains is the last stretch of a story that once consumed front pages. He knows legacy is not his to write. It belongs to the public, to court files, to the families who lived with consequences, and to a city that treats memory like a civic sport. He can only supply the ending he prefers. A man growing older in peace, moving through rooms with courtesy, leaving more kindness than controversy behind, and letting the record stand without trying to bend it. The name will always carry echoes. He accepts that. He learned, the hard way, that sometimes the most persuasive thing you can do is nothing. No drama, no gambits, no wind-up for an audience that wants a familiar performance. In the quiet that follows, you can hear a different kind of story settle into place, one that trades heat for steadiness and headlines for the ordinary comfort of a life, finally pointed away from courts and towards simple, durable days. He understood by now that a life can quiet down without becoming small. The sun came up the same way every morning, and he let that predictability anchor him. A jog before heat settled in, a shower, a check on scores, a call to see who needed what, then off to a job where the point was to make other people feel welcome. He liked the cadence of hospitality, the grace in getting the timing right, the way a dining room breathes when service flows. People recognized him. Some hesitated, some smiled, and a few walked straight up with a phone in hand. He gave them a picture and a quick hello, watched the moment fade, and turned back to the tasks in front of him. There was freedom in leaving scenes as he found them. The internet gave him a way to speak on his terms. Short videos, quick live sessions, posts that sounded like a neighbor talking over a fence. He kept the focus squarely on sports, food, and the old neighborhood's quirks. Football Sundays drew the most attention, mostly because he treated them like a block party the whole country could attend. He teased predictions and ribbed rival fans, careful to shape the tone for family audiences. He said often that his posts were for entertainment, a way to connect with people who grew up on the same streets, or simply liked the sound of a South Philly accent cutting through game day noise. The platform's rules matched his own. No rough language, no glamorizing wrongdoing, no swinging at bait tossed by commenters, asking about the past. He understood that sports talk, even lighthearted, can creep toward territory he needed to avoid. So he set boundaries. If a conversation veered into the mechanics of betting, he pivoted to matchups and coaching decisions. If a host pushed for stories about old investigations, he pointed back to the public record and moved on. That discipline came from hard experience. He had watched words and laughter, snippets of phrases and nicknames, become exhibits and closing argument lines. He had learned that a shrug can be an answer, and that not every prompt deserves a reply. On good days, the restraint didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a skill. His name still surfaced whenever Philadelphia revisited the era of internal conflict that reshaped its underworld and pushed law enforcement into long campaigns. Documentaries and books kept arriving. One memoir by a former ally who cooperated with the government painted him as a central figure in the 1,990 seconds. He dismissed those pages as a trade for leniency, dressed up as history. He didn't wage a public battle over versions of events. He simply repeated what jurors had decided. He was convicted of racketeering conspiracy with underlying acts tied to illegal gambling and extortion as the court defined them. He was acquitted of the most serious allegations connected to deadly violence during that feud. Years later, in a broad case out of Manhattan, a jury deadlocked on most counts, and he resolved it by pleading to a single gambling offense. He served the custody imposed by both courts. He also acknowledged a supervised release violation years back for associating with people he wasn't permitted to meet, and served the short term that followed. Those entries are in the record, the part of his story nobody has to guess at. He was not the only person shaped by that time. Families across South Philadelphia carried the shock of ambushes and the churn of trials. Parents and children learned to live with empty chairs and loud knocks. The city hardened, then softened, then learned to carry memory without letting it define every day. As those decades receded, a quieter generation of defendants came and went through courtrooms. New names replaced old ones in indictments, focused on gambling networks that adjusted to the smartphone era. The government still talked about loans, debts, and pressure. Defense lawyers still argued over interpretation and credibility. Through that churn, he stayed out of the filings. That absence spoke louder than speeches. A visit north now and then reminded him that South Philly remembers everything. He timed those trips to stay safe and simple. Funerals, family parties, lunches where everyone could see everyone. He never lingered in back rooms. He kept conversations short and in public view. A cafe table became his version of a conference room. Old friends with criminal records might drift by. He waved, smiled, and found a reason to move along. Even after supervision ended, he kept that habit. It sent a message: proximity is not participation, nostalgia is not an appointment, and the way to avoid trouble is to avoid situations that look like it. He also tried something new with his own name. In South Florida, a splashy restaurant venture put his surname on the marquee for a little while. The place drew crowds who wanted to see him and eat well. It also invited the kind of scrutiny that follows famous defendants. He worked the front, shook hands, signed menus, and watched every step stay inside the lines. The venture didn't last, a reminder that notoriety can fill a room, but can't run a business by itself. He let the project end without drama, and returned to the steadier work of being a visible host without being a center of a story. Time gave him a subtle new role. Students, reporters, and readers used his arc to understand how a city moved from a brutal period into something more ordinary. Professors taught about the mechanics of racketeering law with his case as a frame, how prosecutors weave ledgers, tapes, and witness testimony into a narrative, how defense teams attack motives and timelines, how juries separate association from agreement. Journalists talked about the ethics of covering suspected organized crime without turning it into spectacle. Sociologists traced community adaptation, from block clubs to neighborhood associations, from whispered rules to formal governance. He didn't attend those sessions. He didn't need to. He had already lived the slides. The father whose path had shaped his early years did not survive to see this quieter phase. Salvatore Chucky Merlino died while still in federal custody. A fact that never stopped hurting, but never got a monologue. It sat between sentences and shaped decisions in ways only family loss can. If grief teaches, this is what it taught him. The state's patience outlasts bravado, and the pain that lands in one decade can still be echoing in the next. That was reason enough to step carefully, to leave rooms before talk turned heavy, to treat every hello like a moment on the record, even when no one was filming. Without the pressures of supervision, he had more choices. He used them to go smaller, not bigger. He focused on family, on the dependable lull of work, on ordinary fun that doesn't become evidence. He watched games, cooked, and learned to sit still in a way he never had when cameras chased his walk up 9th Street. He gave more attention to small kindnesses, introductions that turned into jobs, a quick donation when a neighbor's fundraiser needed a boost, a message posted about a mom-and-pop shop that could use traffic. Those acts didn't rewrite a past built into court summaries, but they drew a different shape around the present. Even so, there were reminders that fascination endures. A night at the ballpark could turn into a line of selfies. A festival could tilt toward theater if he stayed too long. He wouldn't mock people for that interest. He also wouldn't feed it. A wave, a joke, then back to the conversation he was already having. Those moves were not calculate and conquer. They were the quiet starter set for anyone who has decided not to provide the raw material others could stretch into legend. The city had made him a symbol. He now insisted on being a person in the moments that mattered to him. The last decade changed crime itself in ways that made his biography feel like a snapshot from a different age. Bets moved to phones. Collections hid in ledgers, disguised as anything but. Pressure traveled by text and silence rather than shouted demands. Investigations shifted too, toward servers and encrypted chats. He had nothing to add to that evolution from the inside. He had become the citizen who reads about cases and recognizes patterns from a distance. If forced to describe the difference between then and now, he would say only that attention follows money, and money always finds new doors. The rest belongs to agents, defense lawyers, and judges. For all the restraint, he never hid his love of where he came from. It was there in the way he talked about the market, in the way he guessed a score and connected it to something his uncle once said, in the way he praised a city that knows how to argue with itself and still show up for its teams. He carried that affection like a second language. It bridged him to people far beyond Philadelphia, who recognized the posture of a neighborhood kid who grew up, made a name, stumbled hard, took the consequences, and returned with a softer tone. The question that always trails a person like him, what does legacy look like, has no neat answer. Some will decide the verdicts define him. Illegal gambling and extortion tied to a racketeering conspiracy in the old case. A gambling plea in the later one. A violation for seeing people he wasn't allowed to see. Some will remember the Christmas drives, the parades, the open presence on sidewalks when others hid. He cannot edit those views. He can only make daily choices that point toward a gentler end to a story that once generated more heat than light. That's what he has done. Fewer grand gestures, more small favors, more sunlight, fewer closed doors. He remains firm on a point that has framed his public life. He rejects the title that was assigned to him in headlines. He will say he is not the figure the government sketched on charts. He insists he is a neighborhood man who got too famous to be granted an ordinary doubt. People can agree or not, but they can't change the list in federal files. That is where the two versions meet. A man insisting on the narrow truth of what was proven, and a city parsing what else it thinks it knows. The tension will not fully resolve. Stories like his rarely do. In the near years, the most telling scenes are the quietest ones. A chair on a patio as the sky turns orange. A phone face down during dinner. A text to check on an old friend's surgery. An early night before a Sunday set aside for football and family. He is older now. The clocks he watches are not countdowns to hearings, but the small timers of daily life. The pasta boiling. The last 2 minutes of a game. The moment when he knows it's time to head out before a crowd starts to form. Those clocks sweet him. He wanted, for a long time, to be left alone enough to hear them. When you strip away all the chatter, what remains is a Philadelphia story, with chapters written in the language of courts and kitchens, headlines and handshakes. He grew up in a house where the past weighed heavy, stepped into a period when a younger set challenged the old order, became a figure the city could recognize by silhouette, faced down federal cases that split along careful lines, served real time, came home to a world with different rules, stumbled once on supervision, got back up, and then chose a narrow path designed to avoid the snags that once defined his days. He kept faith with a version of himself that isn't a movie character, and tried to make it stick by repetition, the slow kind that builds over years. If there is a lesson that even people far from South Philadelphia can take, it is that the law is patient and memory is long. Reputation can lift and bury you at the same time. Visibility cuts both ways. And peace, when it comes, looks less like a speech and more like a morning routine. He embraced that last truth late, but firmly. The city will keep telling its own version of his tale. Court files will stay archived. Young reporters will rediscover the photos and ask older ones for context. He will let them. He has his own work now, smaller and steadier, lodged in a rhythm that gives him what the earlier years never could. The chance to reach nightfall without a camera, a courtroom, or a rumor shaping the next morning. On some days, he misses the noise, the way a neighborhood's energy can roar like a crowd. Those are the days he goes to a game or a festival, checks the feeling, smiles, and leaves before it grabs hold. That is the difference time made. He no longer needs to stand at the center to feel connected. He can be in the second row and still belong. The person who once drew cameras now prefers the role of a fan, a patron, a neighbor who knows when to wave and when to walk. That small distinction, earned the blunt way through trials and years behind fences, may be the clearest proof that the last chapter is nothing like the first. So the story rests here, with a man in his 60s who understands the cost of heat and the value of shade. He has been accused, acquitted, convicted, sentenced, released, restricted, and freed. He has denied the labels, owned the parts the law proved, and refused to add to the pile of words that others have stacked around his name. He has found a way to be present without performing, to carry a famous past without letting it run his next hour. And in a city that measures itself by the people it produces, he remains a reference point, cautionary, complicated, relentlessly human, and finally at a distance from the noise he once walked toward with a grin. And so, Joey Merlino's story fades into the quiet streets of Philadelphia, a tale of charm, danger, and survival, in a world where loyalty could turn to betrayal overnight. He lived by his own code, balancing family, friendship, and power, until time itself began to blur those lines. As the night deepens, let the echoes of his empire drift away, leaving only calm and stillness behind. Thank you for spending your night with the Silent Empires. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support keeps these stories alive. Sleep well, and good night.